Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today I get to talk to some old friends and a new friend about trees. And I can't think of anything more important to talk about these days than trees. So, welcome, my friends. I have with me on my screen Eric Davies, who was a graduate student, I guess you still are, in forestry at the University of Toronto when we got acquainted a couple of years ago. And Theri Reichlin, who was also, I think, knew her before she was even a forestry student, but she's now an urban forester in Wales. And in Athens, Georgia, we have Parag Kadam, who is a forester from India, but who studied at the University of Toronto too and got to know these other folks as graduate students. And he's now doing a PhD at the University of Georgia. And also my assistant, Adam Wynne, who's with me as usual, making things technological. And I know that right now, I think you even on your CV, you would describe yourself, Terry, as an urban forester. Is that your job these days?
That's
Why
right.
don't,
Yeah. So,
why don't you start off and tell us what I know what it is, but I bet a lot of people don't. What's an urban forester?
well, that's a person that manages and plants trees in urban areas and cities. Um, um, People generally manage trees for the ecosystem benefits and because trees are really important to have on the urban landscape. So that's what I do. In terms of like my specific role, I work in a very small consultancy based out in Mid Wales. Yeah, in west to Mid Wales. And we basically work with community groups and local authorities to kind of plant trees in their communities, in their neighborhoods. So my two most recent projects were planting trees with schools, with the kids, um, on their properties, and kind of talking about what the importance of urban trees are. And
And you
yeah,
take them out and plant trees with them.
yeah, so we go to their school and I kind of do some of the stuff in the back scene. So kind of, communicating with the teachers on, hey, this is what we're going to do. We got some funding from, from either the government or whoever else. And yeah, we just kind of plan around. I go out with like my cat scanner as well to scan for any wires underground. I mark them beforehand. I've done like pre-designs as well. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. The day of is like the best because we kind of get to hang out with like a bunch of kids, and they're so excited because they've never really thought about like managing trees as a career or anything like that. So they're generally really excited to know that you can get paid for doing this kind of stuff as
I
well.
guess, I guess. I can remember the only tree I ever planted in my life. It was a quince tree. And I wondered all my life, I've wondered how that tree was doing. I'm sure it's not there anymore. Okay, let's hear about your other folks. Now, Eric, when I got acquainted with you a few years ago, you were hanging out in the ravines of Toronto. The wonderful thing about Toronto is we have a lot of quite a few wonderful gorges or ravines that run through the city, and they're sort of like wilderness areas. And you were going around looking for old trees and gathering seeds. What are you doing nowadays?
Thanks for having me, Meta. It's really nice, always nice catching up with you. I think last time I was on this program with you, we were talking about using drones to plant trees, which is, come a long way since we last chatted.
I want you to bring me up to date on that because I hope there's changes along those lines and that it's working. But go on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's an extent. The world is always changing, and urban forestry is one of those things that's really changing quite quickly because it's becoming more relevant. So it's becoming an increasingly exciting field to be a part of. Last time we caught up, I was probably just finishing a 5-year campaign I did in the Toronto Ravines to resurvey a historical biodiversity study, and so we raised about $250,000 and surveyed over 10 graduate students and came up with what is now the largest study probably in the past half a century in the ravines, and found that there was a huge decline in biodiversity across all levels. So the first thing is you notice as a forest ecologist is the trees, the structure of the forest. And so the thing we noticed with the trees is they were declining. Norway maple, for instance, is an invasive, highly toxic invasive species that's increased up to 40% of the ravines. Some areas of the ravines are like 80% Norway maple. And as the invasives have gone up, the natives have gone down, and tree diversity has gone down, and shrub diversity has gone down, wildflower diversity has gone down, bird diversity has gone down, small mammal diversity has gone down. And so, I think it's a bit of it was an eye opener for me in the sense that when anyone with forestry experience, it's not cheap to work in a forest. It's big infrastructure, and the reality is that the urban forest in Toronto is now so degraded that it will cost, it's going to take billions of dollars to restore, and there's just not that money in the public municipal budget. So, my conclusions that I put in the report is that it's really going to require a massive effort, like a public-private partnership, multi-billion-dollar initiative to, and I think this you could apply to any city around the world if you go to. They're doing this in New York City, they're doing this in Beijing and Bogota. Everywhere, the quality of environments has declined to levels that will require now massive ecosystem engineering. It's now an engineering problem. So now since last talking with you, I'm now exploring the world of, like corporate, large-scale ecosystem restoration, working with corporations to try to explore how they could get engaged. And my most recent project was working with Google in downtown Toronto. I was the lead designer on their sidewalk development, like the green part of it.
Oh, wait a minute. That collapsed, though, right?
Yeah,
we should explain what that is. It's run by Google. It was a plan to do a lot on the waterfront of Toronto, right? Explain a little bit about that. And why did it fail? I think the city pulled the plug on it before they really got going, right?
Yeah, so like any project, there's as they call the triple bottom line. There's the economics, the social, and the environment. I was only looking at the environment because it's a very complex project. But in a nutshell, Google has a group called Sidewalk that is an innovation, urban development kind of wing, and they proposed a smart city that would, of course, have lots of technology that would improve, not only economics but the ecological sustainability of some of these things. But there were a lot of concerns, social concerns. Privacy was the big one. But from a green perspective, what I proposed was to turn the whole development into a forest ecosystem, an indigenous Toronto forest ecosystem that was designed to provide habitat for biodiversity that would then provide, be resilient to change and provide ecosystem services and habitat for people to go to as well. And my experience working with this team is they were by far and away the best team I'd ever worked with in terms of their, I thought they had like real pure intentions ecologically, which is the only field I worked on, to make a real winning ecosystem, something, a model, pilots that could be used to improve urban development. So I actually thought it was a really exciting thing and brought together a lot of great people. And my experience with that, I guess, has inspired me to take a second look at industry and working with industry and corporations that I work with academics and municipal government. But now I'm increasingly thinking that some of these big corporations have a lot to offer. So that's where I'm at now.
Good. All right. That's a very good thing to know about and to think about further. Good. Now, Parag, you're in Georgia, and I think your background is more having to do with evolution. Is that right? Tell us your angle on forestry.
Right. So I principally got into forestry in 2016, 2015, around that time. Before that, I was about 5 years, I was studying anthropology, and I was researching anthropology from a primatological point of view. So I was studying human evolution by trying to understand how the primate societies behave currently. And from that, when I was studying, I was working in the forest of Tanzania for 1.5 years, doing research for the same reason. That's where I got exposed exposed to these social institutions and forestry related issues about conflict resolution with local people, as well as the role of the state and the role of the community and the citizens of the state. Those kind of issues like became more prominent in my interest field. So I diverted to forestry issues and understanding forestry as a whole, like management of the forest with all the integrated issues and interdisciplinary research that goes on in those fields. So from there, I became a forester as such, but I still have this social aspects which I don't want to let go of ever, because right currently what I'm working on is for researching for in the impacts of forest certification. So sort of like the impacts of market driven mechanisms of conservation. But even in that aspect, my research, for example, is first chapter is understanding comparisons of standards that are there in, for example, ITO protocol or Montreal protocol, and then comparing those standards with the market-driven, the corporate systems of standardization. So, and this kind of comes from stakeholder theories and like very social issues that are prominent in those kind of systems and institutions. So even coming from the interdisciplinary aspects of people like Eleanor Ostrom, like who have been like working into from economic side. Eleanor Ostrom, she was a economist. She won the Nobel Prize for her work on so public good, basically, how management of public goods and those kind of things. So these issues of stakeholder like coordination and standardization of forestry practices comes from economics, like Eleanor Ostrom's economics theory.
Oh, what is her angle then? What was she?
So, she studies the management of public goods. So, like any public properties that are there, and how can we manage them? What kind of systems of institutions can be instituted so that like the distribution and management of resources can happen effectively and efficiently, basically. So, and from her perspective comes from economics. The like she goes against the older economics of only profit driven and corporations of having like individual identities and then earning profits from their this thing, instead of going towards more network analysis of communities being involved in the corporation. So the stakeholder theory being one of the adjacent theories to her management of public goods. Where I use this research for forestry certification is when you're recognizing forestry practices of corporations or even like any management entities that are there in urban spheres as well as in the rural spheres, because that distinction is also very important in my research. So where these kind of standardizations occur and the governance systems play out is where my research is currently right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Well, it'll be interesting if you and Eric see whether you and Eric have the same angle, because he's getting interested in the importance of using of corporations. Now, I'm interested in the notion of urban forestry because a couple of years ago, there was you will remember the name of this outfit in, I think, Zurich, that produced a very important report saying that for global warming, we need to plant 1 trillion more trees. There are 3 trillion, I believe, in the world now. Is that right? And we need another 1 trillion. And in order to do that, I think we'd have to plant maybe 2 trillion because trees don't all live. So one of the things that interested me was the fact that they were proposing, they seemed to be suggesting that the place where a lot of those trees would be either planted or would grow on their own was in the Arctic. But everything else that I was reading was saying that for the most part, trees in the Arctic or in any area of permafrost accelerate global warming by warming the soil somewhat and getting the methane to be released, and you have a big problem. And so I was trying to find out where one could plant all these extra 1 trillion trees. And I don't think you can get, the obvious place is you want to plant it where the land is not already have houses on it. And you don't want to plant it where the people are farming. So you have to go very far away to the top of a mountain or someplace. And we can't get people there to do that kind of work. So I'm thinking, what are we going to do? Well, we better either find a technological way of planting trees at great remote distance by things like drones or dropping seeds out of an airplane or something, which I believe doesn't really work. Or we better start planting in the cities more. There's an Indian fellow who got very interested in the technology of forestry developed by a Japanese botanist named Miyawaki. And he was an engineer in India, and he started this company where he builds these wonderful forests, sometimes just the size of a space where you could park your car. It's just a little piece of land, but they build them. They use only indigenous trees. They get a huge mixture of different seeds. They plant them very close together, like 4 trees per square meter, something like that. And then, of course, you have to have people water and weed them and everything for a couple of years. But after that, you have very dense and wonderful forests that are self-perpetuating and great biodiversity. So I really am keen to promote that. So I did this talk show with a guy who invented it. And the weird thing to me is I kept saying, I want to know more about how much you are able to sequester carbon by this kind of forestry. And he didn't want to talk about that because he seems to feel that the only good reason for building forests is because you want the beauty of a forest. And he didn't really want to talk about global warming as an issue. So that was not a conversation we could have. But I would love to have a conversation about global warming and the effect of trees on the environment and on methane exposures, and whether or not we can offset a lot of these problems by planting more forests in our cities.
I just wanted to continue your thought about the tree planting, the things that have been going on. For example, from my experience in India, which is a very limited experience, I should add, in forestry. So over there, even the northern parts of Himalayan mountain areas, which have there are cold desert areas over there as well. So even there are some individuals I've seen there are down to earth reports and YouTube videos as well about people starting forests from scratch and growing them through informed techniques and scientific methodology, actually applying them in the ground, and also involving surrounding communities. Because, like you said, it's more about the beauty, but I feel it's more about the lifestyle. Like I want to have that kind of ease of lifestyle, or just accessibility to peace of mind, or those kind of intangible resources, which are more cultural aspects of these things. I think that are hugely present in terms of why planting behavior can be present in at least in developing countries. I've noticed in Africa as well, where I was there. Yeah, planting behavior sort of also comes from that cultural feeling of being close to a forest. I've also visited some religious forests, right? Like the Davies, they're called in India. So they're called sacred groves, basically. Communities have them around their villages, basically. Nobody's allowed to go there and actually extract them unless and until the village government or the village community actually decides together. And there are some places which are this is properly forest management plan, but without having a forest management plan. But the motivation is the social, cultural, and religious sentiments of the people.
This sacred grove thing, apparently it's very widespread. I've seen pictures of Ethiopia. Christian church in Ethiopia is a very ancient Christian church, and the landscape is sort of brown. It's almost desert, and yet you'll see little spots from the air. You can see little green spots. What that is there's a church, and around each church they have a sacred grove where nobody's allowed to cut anything down, and the trees there are all indigenous, and it's a protected area. So it's a beautiful idea. And this fellow Miyawaki the place where he would get the seeds from his old, he wanted to find species that had been growing as in the native district for a very long period of time. And so he would go to temples and find that around the temple, you could find the original species and he'd collect seeds there.
I guess the thing that we should want to ask here is really, what's the best thing to do? Like when you mentioned the Trillion Tree Initiative, at a global level, we have removed about half of the world's forests, so the world could take about another 1 trillion trees. And so, in terms of like this chat about urban forests, it's neat to think about, zooming down to the urban areas. When we look at those urban areas, and from an urban forestry perspective, what's the best thing we should be doing right now? Because there's a million things to do. Mm-hmm. Everyone wants to know, where should we put our focus? And where I put my focus, I've thought a lot about this for a long time, decades. And I think the number one thing to do is map the last remaining native old growth trees and preserve them, because they're the number one asset. Study them and collect their seeds. Collect those local seeds and grow them and use them for local reforestation projects. I've, over the past 5 or 10 years, I've mapped out about 1,000 old growth trees in Toronto, and I've had master's students continuously study the seed biology of these every year, and we're finding out that these old growth trees in urban areas produce seeds earlier and in different stages than is typically thought that they've done in non-urban areas. Now there's a huge ability and opportunity here for us to focus our efforts and get these seeds, because seeds is the thing that is the rate limiting step. If you look at why trees don't survive, a lot of it comes back to the trees. And just to maybe pause here for a moment and hear from Adam on just how beautiful one individual tree can be, maybe from a cultural perspective. Adam, I don't know where you were thinking your motivation for doing this, but was it ecological? Was it social? Was it economic? Where were you coming from?
There's a large American elm tree near Queen Street West in Toronto. And if you're familiar with American elms, they almost went extinct during the 20th century. And this might be a subject to talk about a bit later in this talk. But the risks that trees have too, because trees get pandemics too from invasive species and pests along those lines. So this American elm tree, I was trying to push to the tree to get heritage protection as a site with ecological value, cultural value, and societal value. A lot of people consider heritage as a kind of, buildings and artwork and stuff like this, but this is actual living heritage. It's really quite remarkable to hear that you're doing research on the old growth forest too, because some of these trees have significant genetic benefits, and that they can survive harsh conditions or are outliers for surviving diseases that wiped out many of these other trees. Maybe there's a better example than this one. The 400 or 350 to 400-year-old oak tree that's currently being pushed to be preserved in Toronto, that's older than the city of Toronto. And perhaps you could speak a bit more about the importance of these old growth trees. There's
this one tree right on Queen Street, which Queen Street in Toronto is a very, popular, hip area that people go to. And right off the street is this large, this massive American elm. And as Adam said, American elm was wiped off in North America and actually the world through Dutch elm disease, really. But in North America, the American elm in particular is regarded as the #1 best tree of all time for urban forestry. It's fast growing, it's strong, it's got beautiful canopy. And so it was used to line the streets of American cities all over, and then it was wiped out. And most of these are genetically susceptible to Dutch elm disease. Some of them are genetically resistant. The biology of resistance is very complicated, and it's thought to be ontogenetic, such that resistance and susceptibility can change over the lifetime of a tree. But finding these trees and this is one of the most important things to do, because elm not only is beautiful as a tree for urban beautification and for shading our homes, but it's a very important tree biologically for hosting biological diversity. In fact, there's a lot of species of insects that only eat American elm. This is the beautiful thing about plants. There's a whole biological community that only uses every single plant on Earth. So when we get rid of elm, we get rid of all those insects, and we get rid of all the birds that use those insects. And the thing about elm anyone who loves trees and elms in particular will know that they bloom very early. You know, that they leaf out before anything else, and they provide their little flowers, and then their seeds rain down, and so that whole phenology of trees, and for the, you know, the migration of birds, you know, the biological diversity, a lot of it's migratory, and the elms provide, you know, stopping grounds during the migration. So, you know, this work that Adam's doing with, I guess, the heritage trees is, it's almost, if you can you know, inspire people to see how culturally interesting a big old tree is, it's almost the initial road for appreciating their biological value, which is, you know, and then using these as epicenters for urban restoration.
When I met you, Eric, I think you had a weekly column in the Toronto Star where you were giving a photo of a special tree that you'd located in Toronto. Is that right? You also said that at some point you were talking about taking children and showing them these magnificent old trees and teaching them to collect the seeds and so on, and maybe to sprout them and so on.
Yeah. So, you know, briefly, the Toronto Star, Megan Ogilvie, a wonderful, you know, young reporter who came up with this idea of having a tree of the week in the Toronto Star, you know, from all around to Toronto, to ask the public of Toronto, where's there a big tree? And this was inspired by the work I was doing in Toronto. And she wanted to put a tree in the paper every week, and did a fantastic series of articles in the Toronto Star on the work I was doing, and then asked the public to, you know, at the end of this article, said, do you know a tree in your neighborhood? Which is this kind of approach that I have long advocated for. And so now there's, you know, dozens of trees all around Toronto. It's inspired people to do this. And you know, Theri actually has done some tree. I do a lot of tree walks in the city of Toronto, and get people, you know, of all ages out there. Theri actually, a lot of people, myself included, are there for, you know, the kind of biological sciences and you know, researching these things. But you can quickly you know, it can quickly get boring to the average person if you're too caught up in science. And then Theri was one of those people that was, you know, very, very science driven on their MFC project, but also very interested in the kind of cultural side of forestry, and started, rejuvenated the forest, you know, Forestry Students Association, the timber sports team, and a lot of this stuff. And it's the, you know, this is the kind of gasoline that gets these initiatives going. So, Theri, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you're doing, like in Whale together.
Thanks, Eric, for the very kind words. Yeah, so I kind of am. I guess you can like say that the stereotypical forester joined the sector because they don't want to deal with people all day. That's kind of like people that I've met, and you know, like deep in the forest sector, they kind of just don't want to. You know, a lot of my colleagues from the past and stuff, they don't want to deal with, you know, anyone really. But forestry and urban forestry is about managing people more so than managing trees, really. But yeah, so I'm kind of a weirdo in that sense, because you know, like I love people. It's like it's my fuel. And I really have been noticing during the pandemic, when I haven't really seen anyone all day, that my general overall being is just not as great. But yeah, so I just love talking about it, you know, like I just I kind of want everyone to, I want everyone to share that kind of passion, because it is so important. And the walk that we did with Eric, I think that was we had a couple of professors too, right, join us to talk about, was it winter seed collection, I think?
Yeah, winter tree ID, I think. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Winter
tree ID. That was what, 4 years ago now.
Yeah.
Long time.
Say again, winter tree
ID. So identification of trees is really easy in the summer, because every leaf has their own shape and stuff like that. But in the winter, it's more confusing, because not everybody is really familiar with like the bark, you know, the feel and the look, you know, and the look of the bark and the buds and the twigs and the structure of the twigs. So that was, to me, really interesting, and I'm nowhere near as good as I should be at this point in my career. But yeah, there's like a bunch of different ways to really identify trees, even if they have no leaves on.
That's interesting to me, because I think the only leaf that I could actually draw a picture of from my memory is an elm leaf. because when I was growing up in Oklahoma, when I was a little kid, there was a row of elm trees right in front of our house. And my brother and I went back to look at our hometown about 3 years ago. And of course, there are very few trees left. Those trees are gone, and the big cedar tree was gone too. But I think the country is drying up. It looks a lot more desertified. There's not as much greenery in that part of the country. But it's interesting that I can remember that elm leaf, so that I think I could draw one right now. But that's the only tree in the world that I could identify by the shape of the leaf. So you've taught me something about how people actually learn species, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yes. Sorry, go ahead, Eric. I was just gonna.
You go, Terry.
All right, Metta. There's there's a maple leaf, or one, a picture of.
I actually don't think I could draw a
Canadian flag.
maple leaf, but I could draw one of an elm.
For me, I find that really weird because, like, obviously, I was born in '91, so like the Dutch elm disease was kind of before my time. So when I actually found like an elm tree or like a sapling of it, I couldn't for a while realize what it was. I was like, oh my God. Because I haven't actually seen that many elms in my lifetime. So
elms are just. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, elms are just one of many species that have had significant devastation from disease and pests and stuff like that. American chestnuts were another one. American elms, as we were mentioning. Also, we're now seeing issues with the beech trees in Toronto and the emerald ash borer targeting native ashes. We also see there's another risk of the loss of biodiversity with hybridization of tree species, because elms are notorious for mixing with other tree species. So the seeds may have stuff from the host tree, but they end up being mixed together with whatever else is in the neighborhood too at times. So in this case, with the Fenning Street elm tree, you might get Siberian elm, Chinese elm, rock elm, wych elm, Japanese, all mixed together, depending on how the tree opts to hybridize and depending on whether there's other American elms in that area. As Eric mentioned before, Toronto's biodiversity has really declined in recent decades, and I am hopeful that there will be a push to bring it back to a higher degree of biodiversity and then also ecological health. There's also, I don't know if anyone's mentioned this so far, invasive tree species in the urban context. Ailanthus, which is the tree of heavens, that I think have taken over many urban ecosystems around the world, North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Australasia, all those different areas. This tree is originally from Taiwan and southeastern China.
What tree did you say?
Tree of heaven, Ailanthus, which is the Latin name of tree in heaven.
No.
It's sometimes used for traditional medicines, but many people are more familiar with it as it grows all over the place, and it does have a very pungent aroma that some people find off-putting. I'm not sure regarding the traditional medicine how precisely it's prepared, and whether people are actively harvesting it or if they buy it pre-made. There's also a lot of other invasive species. Eric mentioned Norway maples. My apologies, you did mention invasive species before, Norway maples, which are decimating the ravine system. So there's a lot of threats to ecological diversity too that I would like to kind of parse out in a bit more detail if possible.
That's right. And it's you're right. It's not just Toronto, it's the whole world. I think, well, from my experience in the UK, like we're dealing with loss of ash trees through Kalara, or like ash dieback, which is a huge issue here now. And it's affecting, like you can think about pest and disease, but like unless you see it in like a real world scenario, like I don't think you have an idea of what actually happens. Like you can drive along the highways of southern England and like see all these dead ash trees along the road, and that has a huge implication from, let's say, an insurance and a safety standpoint, right? Because at any given time, these the trees that have ash dieback are super brittle, and like at any given time they can just snap, fall on the road, and kill somebody, right? So a lot of like tree maintenance, I think, especially from an urban from a disease and pest standpoint, is like keeping people safe as well, right? Because I don't know if there was like a case and I think it was in Toronto in Trinity Bellwoods where a branch fell into somebody.
It killed somebody. They were having a picnic with their fiance, and it landed on them when they were having a picnic and killed one of the fiancés. Yeah,
that's tragic, and it happens here too sometimes, right? So I think, yeah, like from that standpoint, and I've done a lot of surveys with, so in my last job, my major project was like a 2-month trip in Scotland, and I was surveying, dead, dying, and dangerous trees along the highway network. So, and a lot of these trees there were not invasive or anything, but they were just not safe really because they haven't been managed for so long.
I do have a question for you about that.
Yeah.
Does the UK have a stronger stewardship when it comes to removing unsafe and diseased trees? I heard for the elm program, one of the cities, it might have been Brighton, had a very stringent policy for removing infected elms. Here in Toronto, if this tree is a city-owned tree, you can sometimes get them to remove it. It's still a very slow process if it's diseased or if it's at risk of falling. I noticed if it's on private property, even if the tree is infected with Dutch elm disease or emerald ash borer or blacknet blight, stuff like that, they are very hesitant to have a property owner be required to remove a tree, even if it poses danger to ecological health, because it would cost the homeowner and property taxpayer money. And they don't want to be the municipality that said you have to spend thousands of dollars taking down this tree, even though the tree is going to cost thousands of dollars in collateral damage from infecting other trees and causing damage. So do you know in the UK, is there a bit more stringent, or other countries, is there a bit more stringent or strict policies around this? Or
is that, for instance, the United Nations and groups like that, but I'm familiar with the work that the United Nations has done with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, when they've looked around the world in a lot of these areas that have high density populations living at or below the poverty line, and they're looking, for instance, at the management of resources when they are owned and managed by the local people. Now, you'll see this across the world. And when you give ownership of the resources to local people, they conserve them more because it affects their bottom line. And I mean, you see this in Canada. You see this with the lobster wars that are happening right now. And, of course, we don't want to, there's tragic elements to the lobster wars, social ones that we don't want to have. When you look at the reason why the wars are happening is because everyone's concerned about the resource going down.
I totally agree with that aspect. There is one, I just want to mention, I feel there is limitation to that approach as well, in the sense that values like legacy. So for example, where I work in Georgia, or in the south of US in general, the value of legacy, for example, I manage my forest so that I want my future generations to own it or something like that. So that value is very cultural. It's almost impossible to be monetized. It's very relative as well.
Now, are you speaking about privately owned lands or publicly owned lands?
Privately owned lands.
Okay, so that's a different thing, because if they're privately owned lands, of course, then the legacy is an important idea, and it's a useful idea. But as soon as you talk about public lands and you try to sell legacy, it doesn't work, because you get the tragedy of the commons. You get this idea that everyone loves the idea, but everyone's going to go in and cut a tree down for firewood if they can, or whatever. They'll use it for mountain biking. They'll overuse it.
Can I ask you said that a lot has happened since our conversation about drones. I recruited you and Andy Smith to help me interview some people in Britain who had a company where they were planting large numbers of forests around the world with drones. And and I had followed that up in other ways and didn't really find it as promising as I'd hoped it would be. The later reports that I ran across were not very inspiring. Although, of course, I suppose if you look at one situation in one locality, it's going to be different from a different place or different bunch of methods that they use. Has there been any change or development in that? Or I would think that we need a mass system of planting trees in very remote areas where you can't really take people, away from roads and so on. So that's why I was hoping that drones would work. Can you bring me up to date? Is there anything new on that?
Yes and no. So what's changed is the technology gets better every year, and so the drones are better in some of the technologies for planting these things. However, my thought on it is the same as it was last time when we chatted about this. Is it's being sold as a bit of a silver bullet and a catch-all solution for planting 1 trillion trees, which it isn't, and it never will be, because the most important thing really to plant 1 trillion trees is to let forests plant them themselves. And this is what, you can talk to Terry as a forester. What foresters do is they want to encourage, as the first line of forest regeneration is natural, what they call natural regeneration. That's using seeds from the local area that are locally adapted and utilizing ecological principles like succession to help expedite the process of reforestation back to a forest. So far too much of that basic science of silviculture has been overlooked currently to date, and in favor of these kind of attempts to solve the solution with technology. But I mean, it's really
I would think the speed of it is matter. I mean, wouldn't you have to wait a long time for a forest to take care of itself and regrow?
No, interestingly, no, it's actually the opposite. Drone planting is way slower because mortality is so high that the nature seeds forests at rates of almost incalculable seed density, and it's that density that allows natural selection and ecology to happen. I mean, that's the whole, what we want to do. We don't want plantations back of straight road trees planted by drone. We want forests back.
Got it.
So, you can talk to the kind of stuff, this is why I'm mapping out old growth trees to use these as epicenters for reforestation. And this kind of gets back to what Terry was saying about, of course, there's different elements of this. And one of them is the educational aspect and using trees as epicenters for ecological and cultural and economic, vehicles for advancing these things. And I still think that it's going to be this blending of the new technology. So although I don't think that the current way in which the drone argument, I don't think it's a realistic one. And I think, but I think it could be integrated. And I think currently I'm working with drones right now to do seed surveys. And so there's things like you can use near infrared, and you can use different filters that you can fly above and use the drones as a tool, as we do with all science, right? And it's another tool in the battery. And I think that's the exciting thing, is how it can help advance.
Oh, okay. So what happens? You have these infrared pictures of what? The trees, or of this? You can't take pictures of seeds.
Yeah, you can actually. I mean, it's like they can actually tell crops from space now. They long have been able to do this using technologies, of spectral light analysis. Analyzing the refraction of light off surfaces. So you can use satellites, you can use planes, you can use drones to fly over crops, and this is how they do this now. Like you can tell soybean harvest by the refraction of light on the seed pods, and so.
So you're actually taking, the images are of the seeds themselves on the ground.
No, so you're flying over with a drone, and if this is a tree,
yeah,
the leaves reflect light differently than acorns do, or anything does. So you right now there's a tool called LiDAR, and this is a common way of using light and radar and all kinds of technical different spectrums of light that you can use to map. I mean, they're doing this right now to map out elephants in the jungles in Africa, and they're finding out that it's actually very interesting. Male and female lions hunt in different way depending on body sizes, so you can now see through the forest, see through ecosystems with all kinds of tools. I mean, we're now using this stuff to discover historic human settlements underground by the density in England. I mean, they're doing this all over. They're discovering in Latin America, ancient civilizations with this. So I guess it's bringing to bear this technology down on the old art of forestry. And this is Terry has experience with this in Europe. This is the birthplace of forestry.
Tell me, they're not yet there, but I would love it, I think, if the drones could actually go pick things.
They can do that.
Can they? They can
collect
seeds and bring them home, because there are places where people really can't go to collect seeds, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where the exciting discussion on the drones will be. It won't be using them exclusively to plant trees. It'll be using them in this multifaceted way to go collect information and then collect the seeds and bring them back. And
because at one point you were trying to persuade me that you have to be very precise about where you plant a certain kind of tree. That if you take a seed from up in some park north of Toronto and bring it down to plant it in Scarborough, it might not do as well, because the environment is exactly specific to particular kinds of trees, etc.
Yeah.
Are you still? I mean, that would mean that not only do we need to have a map of where particular seeds are native, but a very specific map of where they belong to, where they should be planted, right?
Yeah, and
is anybody working on that level of specificity?
yes, and when they did that about 200 years ago and 100 years ago in Ontario, and we've got remarkable soil map. I mean, this is all being done not just with forestry, but also with agriculture, right? So when you look at North America, you'll notice what they call the physiography. So you've got the bedrock and the topography, and then on that is the soil, and you have the soil maps, and on that you have temperature. And so the superficial geology of the continent with the soil on top of that and temperature on top of that creates these bands which you can grow certain crops and certain trees. And so you can look at this in all different scales. You can look at continental, you can box it into a province, you can box it into Toronto. And this is very complex because, of course, only 14,000 years ago, the Northern Hemisphere was under a kilometer of ice. And since it's melted with rapid climate change historically, non-man-made climate change, just the natural, climate change of Earth, the Northern Hemisphere has been reforested and recolonized by plants. Now we have accelerated climate change. It's not always as easy just to say that what was there before is what is best to be there in the future. Things like urban areas have the urban island heat effect, and things like higher temperatures, up to 10 degrees in urban areas, and more runoff, and you kind of creating a bit of a novel, type of ecosystem, as they say. This is often sold a little too feverishly, I think. And but they do have things they're talking about, like assisted migration and helping certain trees that advance. With human-assisted migration. I mean, this again is a neat idea. However, it's very, very dangerous if not practiced by experts, because we don't want to give people the false impression that we can just move species up from the south and forest management will all of a sudden become perfect. I mean, the problem is that we have very poor forest management in urban areas. Canada has some leading examples of forest management in certain areas for sure, but we need to do a better job at managing our trees. Like, our ecological health of forests in urban areas is disastrous because we've lost native species and we've got the invasion of invasives. So I think we have to really start with first principles of forest management, forest ecology, and that starts with basically restoring native species that we've lost and getting rid of invasive species.
Well, I'd like to ask Theri more about that, because it sounds to me as if that's a way to make some progress. If the kids are interested and have fun out there planting trees, why don't you also offer a little course, maybe an after-school course, on how to identify local trees and the right kind of seeds and how to collect them? And you could make these kids into real experts, couldn't you?
Yeah.
And I bet they would love it.
It is fun, and they definitely. So there are some schemes in Wales, at least, called eco schools, or forest schools, so that they kind of do some outdoor education once in a while and so on. But definitely, I think in terms of like the overall population being motivated and knowledgeable about trees in the first place, it's probably going to take a bit of a cultural shift. Like, I can do my bit here, and some other community inclusion officer or whoever would do their bit over there, with like a Saturday morning planting. But I think we need to do a lot of work from the point now where kids can recognize, like, corporate brands and logos and this and that, to actually recognizing, tree leaves, leaf shapes and stuff like that. So there's, I think there's a lot of work to be done for sure.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, that sounds terrific. And I think we're just about ending our allotted time together, which is a pity because I'd love to keep going for another hour or two. I've enjoyed this very much. Carry on. Stay in touch.
Thanks for having me, Metta, and nice to meet all you folks, and nice to see you again, Theri.
Nice to see you too, and thank you again, Metta.
Thank you.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.